Meta says it will soon start blocking Canadians from news content on Facebook and Instagram. It's in response to Bill C-18, which was recently passed. It forces tech giants to pay media companies for the content they link to. Heritage Minister Pablo Rodriguez told the CBC's Rosemary Barton that Canada is not the Wild West and that tech giants need to pay their fair share to support Canadian journalism.
These people can come here and do whatever they want. That doesn't work like that in Canada, not in a democracy. And I cannot accept that a company like Meta comes here and threatens us and threatens a sovereign country. And if we don't stand up for Canadians, who will?
Rachel Curran is the head of public policy for Meta Canada. Rachel Curran, thanks for coming in.
Thanks, David. Great to be here.
So when we've had Minister Rodriguez on this show, he says Meta has his number, they know how to reach him, and he's willing to sit down and negotiate. Are you willing to sit down and negotiate with them so that you don't have to do this news ban?
So if that were possible, sure. It's just not possible the way the bill's drafted, unfortunately. We've had really constructive discussions with heritage officials. We've had really good discussions with the minister's office. But the way the bill is drafted doesn't allow for negotiations outside the framework of the legislation. So there are no negotiations currently. We are proceeding towards ending the availability of news permanently in Canada. We wish we weren't here, but we are here. And there is really nothing at this point that's going to alter that trajectory.
Well, what makes negotiations so impossible? Because I know the bill has received royal assent, but the government talks about this regulatory phase that could take until the end of the year where they determine how exactly it applies. Why can't you find a solution in there?
So, David, what's done by legislation cannot be undone by regulation. That's the, a saying. If you're a student of political science or law, you'll know that very well. So the regulation-making process can't alter the fundamental premise or the sort of underlying structure of the bill. And so there's nothing at this point that can address our fundamental concerns with the bill, which is that it requires us to compensate news publishers for placing material on our platforms voluntarily because they get a tremendous amount of free marketing and distribution value from that.
So Minister Rodriguez says that this is a bully tactic by a big tech corporation with lots of money. They point to the fact that you do this already in countries like Australia where you've cut deals where you pay. What makes this so different?
So let me just say, in Australia, we are actually not designated under the legislation, and the Australian bill is quite different. It allows for negotiation of private deals outside the framework of the legislation. Now, we chose to do that in that particular context when the government was able to offer us some assurance about the amount of our liability, the scope of what we would be liable for under that bill. And so we have not yet been designated under the Australian legislation. We signed a series of private deals in Australia that prevented us from being designated. Now, we've done the same thing here in Canada. David, we've signed 18 deals with publishers in Canada. We want to support news. We particularly want to support news in their transition to the new digital reality. And so we proceeded with these deals in Canada on the assumption that our support for news would be, a good indication that we were willing to do in Canada what we had done in Australia. However, the bill, as it's drafted in Canada, doesn't allow us to do that outside the framework of the legislation.
Okay, so what happens to those 18 deals? You have various companies and publishers who are obviously dependent on that income to some degree. What happens to those under C-18? Do they end?
Well, look, I can't comment on current commercial deals, but we are taking a look at those. And certainly there is provision in those deals for them to be changed or altered if legislation moves forward that changes the regulatory landscape in Canada. So we're looking at that currently, and I'm not yet sure what the outcome will be. But the reality is, if we are ending the availability of news in Canada, there probably isn't much of a future for those deals.
The fact that you were willing to sign these deals, the fact that you're willing to do deals in other countries like Australia, I mean, it puts on the table that Facebook and Meta is willing to compensate for this content in some way. I mean, and also the tech companies have drastically changed the advertising market, which has created a real problem for publishers. What are you prepared to do outside of C-18? I mean, is there a negotiation you can have with the minister that's outside of C-18? Is there a way around this legislation so that you don't ban these publishers from your platform? Because we've had some of them on this week, last week, and they said it was existential to some of the smaller digital publishers, and this could kill them.
Yeah, I wish there was, David. I wish there was a way that we could negotiate deals or come to some kind of compromise solution outside the framework of Bill C-18, outside the framework of this legislation, but there's really not. The way the government has drafted it, within 6 months at the absolute maximum, we have got to self-declare as a designated news intermediary. And at that point, we are subject to the entire framework of the bill, which requires us to engage in negotiations with publishers across the country for an amount that right now is totally uncertain and completely uncapped. We know the government is aiming to get approximately, $75 to $100 million annually in Canada. But that's, at this point, the amount is totally uncertain. No business could operate that way. No business will operate that way. And so we have to comply with the bill by exiting the market for news availability in Canada.
What does that do to your platforms, though? Not having credible news sources on it. There's disinformation. Social media and big tech is often criticized for its role in that. If legitimate information is gone, this creates a huge canvas for disinformation and misinformation to fill in.
Well, let me challenge that a little bit. We've got 24 million users in Canada. They share things that entertain them. They share updates on their daily lives. Information will still be available from government sources, from non-governmental organizations, from community organizations. All of that, from emergency services, all of that material will still be available on the platform. We don't think that's bad information. Also, we have the largest global fact-checking program in the world. We have 90 independent fact-checking agencies who are fact-checking viral misinformation in 60 different languages. And that fact-checking work is going to continue in Canada as well.
Right, but we are going to potentially have a situation where a declining Canadian media industry loses a very important platform for it. How quickly are you going to have this ban implemented? I know the regulatory phase for the government could take until the end of the year. When do you start blocking CBC and everyone else from putting their information on your platform?
So we have said we're going to implement a permanent solution to end the availability of news in the coming weeks. We're looking to the timeline in the bill to do that. Now, the Senate inserted an amendment to the bill that required that it come into force no later than 6 months from royal assent. And so that's the timeline we're working with. But look, David, we don't want to be in this position. We don't want to be ending the availability of news on our platforms in Canada. This is not something we would have chosen to do had we been given the choice. But the way that Bill C-18 is drafted just exposes us to a liability that's not workable for us.
So when the minister says this is a threat and a bully tactic and essentially a bluff and to give him a call and try to negotiate a solution, is there any point in even having that conversation at this point?
Look, it's a business decision. And we have been telegraphing to the minister's office and to his officials for many, many months now that we would make this decision if Bill C-18 passed and received royal assent, which it has done now. So our trajectory is set. There is no way to negotiate out of the framework of this bill, as we discussed earlier. And so, unfortunately, we are going to have to end news availability for Canadians on our platforms. And that's, again, David, it's not something we would have chosen to do. We don't want to be here.
It just seems with the resources of the government of Canada at its disposal, and with a giant company like Meta, there has to be a workable solution that doesn't see this happen. It seems crazy to me that you can't find a way forward between the two sides on this.
Yeah, look, we've been talking to the minister's office and to his officials for many months now. Like Google, I think, has said, they have been proposing alternative, reasonable solutions for many months now. They've had no take-up on that. We have experienced the same thing. I wish there was a solution. We told the government, if this bill receives royal assent, our trajectory is set. And at this point, David, I think the only way out of this bill is if it were to be amended or repealed. Now, of course, it's open to the government to do that. They can do that, but that requires taking any amendments through Parliament. Perhaps they'd be willing to do that in the fall. We'll see.
Rachel Curran, thanks for your time.
Thanks, David.